Okay, so apologies in advance about the sound. I know it's still not ideal. It tends to go up and down. I really don't know why that's that. The big story today, at the moment, really is Article 50. It's been triggered today, which means that, and of course, I'm not talking about triggered in the socio-political sense, but literally triggered as in set off. Um, so we are leaving the European Union. That's the big story today. Now, if anyone recalls the whole Brexit debate last year, you may recall I made a video explaining why I voted Remain. I don't regret my decision. It's a decision I stand by. Um, and for that reason, I do feel some sadness today, and I do feel some uncertainty about the future. Um, Before I talk about my own feelings, this is the coverage in the Times today. So, quite a striking photograph of the Prime Minister, and she's signing Article 50. They have a piece on Sir Robert Walpole saying that his critics saw him as very corrupt. However, he kept us out of European wars for 20 years. So it's an interesting parallel there with Sir Robert Walpole. Since we joined the EU in 1973, 8 prime ministers have presided over our membership of the EU. Heath Wilson, Thatcher, Heath Wilson, Callaghan, Thatcher Major, Blair, Brown, Cameron, and May. Um, and it's always been a major issue for the British. Let me be very clear, I am a European and I will always be a European. I feel that very strongly. I feel it as strongly, really, as my British identity. But there's a few things I'm seeing going around that I think are a little bit absurd. I mean, one thing I will say to Remainers, some of my fellow Remainers, I should say, is the world is not about to end. I get that you're disappointed. I get that you're concerned about some of the implications of this, and I'll come to those in a minute. But the world is not about to end, so we need to stop doom mongering because that isn't going to help anyone. It's not the end of the world. It's in no one's interest for this to be really messy. It's not in Britain's interest, and it isn't in the interests of our European partners either. And they are still our European partners. They will still be major trading partners. So it would not be in their interest to punish us. And I don't think I see people saying things like, "Oh, this shows how nasty the EU is." Well, here's the thing. We're taking a little bit of a petulant attitude there because if you join a club, um, and you say pay a membership fee of that club, and then you decide to leave the club, you can't complain if the club decides to, not let you have the benefits of it. So we cannot leave an organization of states and then complain that they're holding certain things back or there are going to be some implications. That would be the same for any country that leaves. I'm not sure if that is the same as threatening us. So I think the leave side also need to be responsible with the way they're describing this. Um, on the other hand, I have never been a zealous bureaucrat. And some of the things that I've been seeing today are a little bit absurd. I saw one post from this gay guy, and he said, "Now my rights are going to be rolled back." Well, that's a little bit absurd. The idea that as a gay man suddenly he's going to be under threat, that's nonsense. Um, so I think some of the hyperbole on both sides needs to stop. From the Leave side, um, the constant presentation of the EU as this horrible dictatorship. It's absurd. Um, and also on the Leave side, I get a little bit fed up of the notion that all Remainers are liberal elites who don't care about their country. It's perfectly compatible to love your country, but also believe that we should have stayed in the EU. And it isn't always straightforward. I mean, one of the interesting things I saw today was a farmer. Now, you would think farmers are very Eurosceptic. This guy said he was sad about today and it was bad for business. So there's going to be a lot of mixed messages coming out. Um, the Leave side did win, and I've seen some Remainers say ridiculous things about the Leave side. I saw one woman claim that, we shouldn't feel sorry for them. They're the horrible people who will bring us back to the Dark Ages. Get a grip. I'm not suggesting all Remain people think like that, but there is, as a Remainer, I do notice a slight snobbery, frankly. That's how it comes across on the Remain side. Like, they're intellectually inferior to people who voted Leave. A lot of people who voted Leave gave a great deal of consideration to it. And they voted Leave because they felt it was best for the country, just like we voted Remain because we felt it was best for the country. Now, I would not take kindly if a Leave person called me a liberal elitist, and I don't expect they would take kindly if we called them, a little Englander racist. There has to be responsibility on both sides. Um, as a Remainer, I do reject the notion that some of the Leave side constantly puts out there. But the fact is, we're leaving, and I don't see the point of doom mongering at this stage. It may be that there could be a foreseeable situation in the future where we would rejoin, but we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens in the French election. We'll see if other countries decide to leave. We have to put things in context. This does not mean that we're no longer part of Europe. It doesn't mean that we're no longer going to trade with European countries. I am concerned about some of the implications. I'm concerned in particular about travel. Um, for example, getting visas, that sort of thing, whereas before traveling to other EU countries was relatively straightforward. I'm a bit concerned about that, and I think it's going to be a bit of a hassle. Some people downplay that. I think it's a bit unfortunate because that was one of the great benefits of the EU. It was easy to travel as tourists from state to state. Now that's going to be more complicated, and I do envisage price hikes. Again, that's unfortunate. Um, I also think that there has to be a cast iron guarantee for both British nationals in the EU and EU nationals in Britain. There has to be guarantees on both sides. If I was an EU national in Britain, I wouldn't blame them for feeling concerned. The Prime Minister can make assurances, but the truth is there is a hardcore element on the Leave side, and this is not the majority, but there's a hardcore element there that do have, quite frankly, a tribal mindset. And there's no point denying that they don't because it is there. And it is this notion that it's a kind of us and them mentality. Now, there are people who say the coverage of the EU has been biased in favour of Remain. I would strongly dispute that. The overwhelming coverage in Britain over the EU for years has been negative. I remember I went to the EU Parliament in 2008, and I remember at the time thinking that what happened was my local MEP invited me to a trip to Brussels. It's very interesting, but I remember at the time that was my feeling that why is the press in this country so overwhelmingly negative about the European Union? So I think that's a big issue as well. The coverage of Spain, with one or two exceptions, um, I mean, if you look at the way the likes of the Daily Mail and the Daily Express and the Sun cover the EU, you would think that we're talking about a brutal dictatorship. The EU has many faults. It does. But it has also guaranteed a lot of basic human rights that we wouldn't necessarily have had without the EU. Now, it's not a simple case of, the Leave side is anti-immigration, the Remain side is pro-immigration. There's those on the Leave side who would be very pro-immigration from Commonwealth countries. So there's a lot of ways to look at this. I also would suggest to some of my fellow Remainers, especially those who are very zealous about it, you're being short-sighted if you think the EU doesn't have problems. You're being short-sighted if you think that people who complain about the EU are just narrow-minded nationalists. That's not really is not that simple. Um, I consider myself an internationalist, and I take issue with a lot of EU things. I do think there has been an incredibly arrogant bureaucracy from the top. I do think the EU as an institution hasn't listened to Europeans, not just in Britain, across the continent. Um, and until it addresses that, until it starts to understand that people complaining, it's not just pandering to the far right. There's legitimate grievances out there. There's also ethical issues on the enormous amount of waste that the EU has. I mean, when they are measuring, for example, the exact size of a carrot, and then when you consider there's people starving to death in this world, it's things like that I think really drive people crazy over the EU. So those are all things that need to be considered. But frankly, those are all debates of the past. We're out now. What matters now is what approach do we take from this day onwards? I would politely say to the Leaves, don't be so triumphalist. Don't be so we won and the other 16 million people need to shut up. We have never been a democracy where the side that loses suddenly has to be quiet and not have a voice. Because this was a referendum. This wasn't a general election. This is, permanent. Like I said, there's a possible chance it could be reversed in the future, but it's different from a general election. Um, my main concern in the short term is about Scotland because I think a 300-year-old union, for me, that would be a far graver situation, the UK breaking up, because we're still European. Whereas if the UK breaks up, that's the country finished. So for me, that would be a far graver situation. And the SNP is unquestionably going to use this as an excuse. Although their argument does wear a bit thin, that they're arguing that one political union is good and another is bad. It's a bit of a flawed argument they have. I haven't been following this actually that closely because there's been a whole number of other things on my mind. There's personal problems going on in my life right now, which means I don't always follow big news stories, perhaps as much as I should. But that's it. I can't help but feel some sadness. Even knowing all the problems the EU has, even appreciating the arguments that the Leave side has, I feel that there was a great deal of misleading on the Leave side from the likes of Mr. Farage and, frankly, opportunistic Boris Johnson and Michael Gove. Um, and I think there was also an overwhelmingly hostile press that really, right up until referendum day, done nothing but vilify the EU as an institution. It looked entirely at the negative and it didn't look at the many positive aspects of membership. But anyway, I'm sure there will be other videos to make, but that's how I feel at present. I'm not as cynical and I'm not as kind of downbeat as some Remainers are. I don't think the world's about to implode. I'm sure we can make a success out of this. We'll have to remember most of our history we were outside the EU. 44 years is quite a while, but if the UK broke up, that would be far graver because that's 300-400 years. Um, we're going to continue doing trade with the rest of Europe. We're going to continue to have good relations with the rest of Europe. It's This is not the end of the world, so we have to stop doom mongering. But the Leave side also has to respect the fact that many people are genuinely concerned, and I don't think it's going to help by just being triumphalist and saying, "Oh, we're right, stop whinging." I don't think that's a good attitude either. You have to listen to concerns that people have because this was not, a really decisive thing. It's not like 25 million people voted leave and I don't know 10 million voted stay. 16 million, 17 million. That was pretty close. So that's my thoughts. And to people on the right who want to, come onto this video and say, Nathan, you need to think this, you need to think that. I'm a 31-year-old man. I make my own decisions. You can disagree with me, but I believe it was a mistake to leave. Now, I hope I'm wrong. I hope things work out. I love this country. I want things to work out well for this country. Um, but no one will ever tell me that I'm not a European.